Welcome everyone to this, the fifth and final of our series of Next Generation Leader Engagement webinars, which have been aimed at linking aerospace and defence postgraduates and high potential employees from around the world. Over the webinar series so far, we've been discussing the exciting future for the sector and some of the challenges and opportunities in four areas: military aviation, civil aerospace, space, and the fourth industrial revolution, AI, robotics, and the Internet of Things. I hope you were able to see some of those sessions, some of them at least, because they've been fascinating and vibrant discussions. Today we're looking at the potential role the A&D sector could play in addressing the enormous global challenges we all face: energy, poverty, water shortage, climate change, hunger and humanitarian relief. And of course, on top of these long-term pre-existing conditions, the world is still coping with the COVID-19 pandemic. In response to the coronavirus, we have seen companies and individuals across the world step forward to offer their services, capabilities and talents. And I'd like to give our heartfelt thanks to all those colleagues who stepped up to work in things like building ventilators, as well as helping with logistics. And of course, to all those people in the health and other vital services who have been working so hard to keep us safe. In today's webinar, we're going to look at how that spirit and energy could be unleashed more broadly to address those global challenges. It's a great honour for me to be moderator for you today. I'm a writer and journalist, but have to be honest, up to the last few months, my knowledge of the world of A&D was pretty minimal. I've written and broadcast on a wide range of subjects: travel, politics, faith and conflict. My career and direction in life was altered in a conflict, the Lebanese civil war, when on my first foreign assignment in the mid-1980s, I was kidnapped and held hostage for 5 years. Up to that point, I'd had a very easy, privileged and safe life. But through that captive experience, I came to understand something of the uncertainties and fear that are tragically part of day-to-day life for far too many people around the world. So I'm very interested to hear how technology, cross-sector cooperation and imagination can work to improve people's lives. We've got a terrific panel of experts to discuss those possibilities, and we'll be hearing from them in a moment. After their presentations and a panel discussion, we'll then be hearing from the next generation leaders who are moderating our first 4 webinars to get their feedback on that experience and their thoughts on today's topic. And we want to hear from you, our audience, too, please. You can post questions throughout the session via the chat function on the page. And we'll try to get through as many of those as we can in our 90 minutes or so. So now to our 5 panelists, who we're inviting to speak for 10 minutes each. They will follow on one from the other, so I'll give a brief introduction to them all now in order of appearance. First up will be Shahid Mughal. Shahid is an industrial analyst, operations and supply chain engineer. He has worked across a number of sectors, including aerospace and defence, high-tech and automotive, where he has led projects and managed teams across the globe. And he's also played a very vital role for us in our webinars because he's been handling all the tech for us. After Shahid will be Neil Morisetti. Neil is Vice Dean of the Faculty of Engineering Sciences at University College London. Before moving into academia, he had a very distinguished career in the Royal Navy. He was a Rear Admiral and Commander UK Maritime Forces and Commandant of the Joint Services Command and Staff College. Subsequently, he worked as a diplomat in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, as the UK Government Climate and Energy Security Envoy, and then the Foreign Secretary's Special Representative for Climate Change. Nick Cook is a storyteller with a background in business consulting and technical journalism. He has written 20 fiction and non-fiction books. Nick started as a reporter for Jane's Defence Weekly in the 1980s, rising to become its aerospace editor, and has maintained a strong interest in technology and technology trends ever since. After Jane's, he set up Dynamics, working at the top levels of the aerospace and defence industry to find global solutions to global challenges. And it's Nick's call to action that lies behind this webinar series, as he'll be explaining in a few minutes. Charles Chase is co-founder of the Unlab, a non-profit organisation working to develop breakthrough technologies and products that are good for people, good for the biome, and further human understanding. Formerly, he managed the Revolutionary Technology Programs Organisation for the Lockheed Martin Skunk Works. Then and now he has been working to change energy, propulsion, communication, and general wellness. Our final panelist will be Pablo Suarez, a water engineer by training. He designed dams and flood management systems in his native Argentina before becoming a humanitarian worker and researcher. As well as a first degree in water engineering, Pablo has a master's in community planning and development and a PhD in geography. He has advised humanitarian and development organizations in more than 50 countries. Okay, so we're all set. Those are our panelists. As I said, you have 10 minutes to give your views, and I will let you know when you've got about a minute left to go. So let's start with Shahid. Over to you.
John, just to check, can everyone see my screen okay?
Yes, indeed. Thank you.
Okay, folks, thanks to everyone who's joined. But before I start, I would like to thank Bert, Nick, and John for inviting me onto the panel. I started working with the team over 5 months ago, working on the subject and listening to thought leaders like Charles and Neil and Nick as well, has transformed my understanding of the key issues. So this presentation is the culmination of the work done so far, as well as my own experience. But before we go there, I'd like to share with you some key metrics, I guess, measurement of human suffering as such. In 2017, 785 million people were without even basic drinking water. Millions were living in hunger, and they continue to do so. We are not on track to end poverty by 2030. 2 billion people lack basic sanitation services. And unless we tackle inequality, 52 million children under the age of 5 will die between 2019 and 2030 due to various issues. 79.5 million, or 1% of the world's population, were displaced people in 2019. And failure to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade will be disastrous for yields of maize, rice, and wheat. So unless we act now, human suffering is likely to accelerate. Now, those are big numbers, I guess, and sometimes it's difficult to relate to. But I would like to share with you, I guess, my own personal experience, and hopefully that makes it a bit real. So those of you who know me will know that I was born and brought up in Kenya, Nairobi. I grew up there up to my teens. And this is really a story of a girl called Grace. She lives in Mathare Valley in Nairobi. It's where I grew up. She's 14 years old. And at the bottom is what the Mathare Valley looked like back in the 40s and 50s. But this is what it looks like now. It's one of the biggest slums in Nairobi, in Kenya. Of course, at the time when I was living there, it wasn't as bad, right? And since the 50s, Nairobi's population has grown from 0.14 million to 4.7 million. 70% of the population live on 5% of the land. And most migrate from rural communities that are impacted by poverty, where farming has failed due to global warming, right? And Grace came to Nairobi, like many do, because the small farm, that family farm, fell due to droughts in northern Kenya. She was a burden on her parents. She ran away from home, like millions of kids do, right? And these are just some of her friends in similar circumstances. They're addicted to sniffing glue, drugs, and beg for a living. Now, the community she lives in, as I said, is Mathare Valley, and it suffers from really poor sanitation and water. This is an example of a communal lavatory that's shared by hundreds, right? It backs onto Nairobi River, which is the source of water supply for bathing. It's full of human waste. And before I just move on, most will know that, or you'll know that, women suffer the most due to poor sanitation. Apart from anything else, these places are really unsafe for women. And then, needless to say, water is unsafe to drink. They have to buy water from freshwater ATMs as such, right? The skeptics amongst us will say this is just one data point. It's Africa. It's to be expected. This is how it's always been. But research shows that this scene is repeated in many countries across sub-Saharan Africa as well as Asia, right? And the key risk is that these types of local issues pose a risk of flaring into something much bigger. At best, it's mass migration that we've seen to Europe. At us, some things such as this can spiral out of control, such as the Syrian conflict did, right? Now, who remembers the genesis of the Syrian conflict? Well, the droughts in Syria from 2006 and between 2006 2011 decimated the farming and rural industry. 75% of the farms failed. 86% of the livestock died. 1.5 million farmers were forced to move into urban slums in Damascus and Homs, along with the Iraqi refugees. So shortages of water and food led to social upheaval, conflict, uprising against Bashar al-Assad's regime, and thereafter sectarian unrest ensued between Alawite ruling class and Sunni majority. So the key point is resources is a threat multiplier. And this quote at the bottom from Kofi Annan is quite prophetic. He says, as we look ahead, we can see real risks with resource depletion, especially freshwater scarcities, severe forms of environmental degradation, may increase social and political tension in unpredictable but potentially dangerous ways. So these local, I guess, issues can spiral out of control pretty rapidly. Now, all is not lost. As I said, I think we have the technology and the capability to make a real difference. And over the course of last few weeks, we've done a number of webinars, right? And they've been really insightful. We learned that in the military aerospace, we learned that technology will change the way, will change the face of modern warfare. It has the potential to significantly reduce loss of life as seen during World War I, World War II. In the civil aerospace webinar, we learned that innovation will make global travel greener and reduce CO2 emissions. In the space webinar, we already explored the outer reaches of the universe, visiting planets. We can land spacecrafts on asteroids, which I guess to a layperson like me is just mind-boggling that we can do that. And then in the fourth industrial revolution, technologies such as AI and robotics promise to deliver a step change in productivity and improve quality of life. But I guess the history of innovation from A&D has already benefited mankind in many ways, right? From innovations such as drones, penicillin, jet engines, internet, computers, which has really enabled the webinar today. These innovations came out of the A&D sector, and they've changed our lives for the better. But I guess the key point that comes again in my mind is, we've got all these capabilities. It's high time we applied them and these technologies to address the global challenges we have and end human suffering. Thank you.
Shahid, thank you for that very powerful introduction to this webinar. I will try and put a bit more flesh on the bones in setting the context before others speak. As Shahid has described, we live in some pretty challenging times, irrespective of where we are in the world, where our homes are. And there are many risks to our prosperity and well-being. Different communities are affected differently. The degree of impact varies. It's perhaps less so in the developed world than, as you heard from Shahid, in Kenya and elsewhere in the developing world. But the reality is that we live in a joined up world, and we're all affected by what's going on all over the world. So therefore, the onus is on all of us to be engaged in trying to address some of these challenges we face. Some of the challenges are perhaps traditional security ones, but others have non-military origins. And there are many descriptions you can apply to them. Grand challenges, global challenges. The Sustainable Development Goals were introduced in 2015 to replace the Millennium Development Goals. It doesn't really matter what you call them. It's all about the same subject. It's all the subject Shahid was talking about and John was earlier in his introduction. Health, education, well-being, good governance, equality, addressing poverty, ensuring sustainable food supplies, peace and justice, the list goes on. And many of them are transnational in nature. we're living through a transnational challenge or threat at the moment through the COVID-19 pandemic. And we've seen the consequences, and we see how they vary from nation to nation. And a lot depends on the capabilities of those nations, particularly in their health sectors, but elsewhere in how the numbers affect the population and how many of the population survives a disease. There's another issue that, and probably the one that's going to present the greatest challenges this century as a transnational one, and that is the impact of a changing climate. Not least because it impacts on and accentuates many of the other challenges that we face, including those relating to health, livelihood, our homes, the availability of key resources, food, water, and land. But also, and Shahid touched on it, the impact of a changing climate and the second and third order consequences. What happens to people when they lose their land or their livelihood? Do they move, or they attract population? Are they susceptible to being recruited by non-state actors and violent extremist organizations as they seek a livelihood and an ability to look after their families? All of that can contribute to the risk posed to geopolitical stability. Shahid mentioned Syria. That's an example where the movement of populations from rural areas to urban areas added to the challenges. We're seeing it now in the Sahel as extreme weather events are damaging crop yields. We saw it in the Arab Spring when the failed wheat harvest in Russia, along with poor harvests in Australia and Canada, pushed the price of wheat up, which increased the price of bread, which is one of the contributing factors in the rioting in the markets in Tunisia. We all need to act to address these challenges, and finding solutions will require both transnational and trans-institutional action if we're to be successful. It will also require activity at the regional and the local level, because we need to have a common understanding of what the problem is, a shared knowledge of the solutions, what works, where. It won't always be the same around the world. Importantly, we need a narrative of why we need to act and the benefits if we act, and the fact that we understand that it is one that all of us have to address around the world, wherever we live. And we need to do that in partnerships, including local communities, if we're going to help deliver the solutions. And some of those partnerships will not be the traditional ones. They will bring in new partners who've not worked before together, and we will need to understand how to work together. And importantly, all of it will need to be done in some form of appropriate governance. Now, I'm sure we're going to talk more about some of these things later, but as Shahid said from the earlier seminars, there's clear evidence that the aerospace and defence sector could, if it wishes to, contribute to this process for the benefit of all, be it in technology provision or the sharing of data. We heard in the space webinar about the use of satellites to provide information on availability of crops, of where water is, and we also heard of how, for example, the Emirates mission to Mars, the data that's going to be generated, which is about the environment and the atmosphere, will be open source and shared by everyone. Anyone can use it to do their research. But it's important that to do that, we collaborate and work in these partnerships. Again, I think we'll talk more about that this afternoon, but at this point, I'd like to hand over to Nick. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed, Neil. And I'm just going to click to my presentation here. So I hope everyone can see that. A&D and Global Challenges 101. I don't have much time to get through a very big subject, so I'm going to take off straight away and obviously thank everyone for having me on this panel today. It's a great pleasure to share some of these important views with you all. Just to take you back to the genesis of my own interest in this, I used to be a reporter with Jane's Defence Weekly. I joined Jane's in 1986. And towards the end of my time there in 2005, I was responsible for a series of articles which I called Technology Audit. And the idea of this was to look at the science and technology base of the 9 aerospace and defense sector primes, which at that time I felt had sort of all become rather samey. You know, they all looked and did pretty much the same thing. So having persuaded the chief technology officers of these companies and their public relations counterparts, of course, that this was a good idea, which was not always apparent to them, because the idea of opening up their science and technology basements to a reporter came with some risk. But having done that, it became a very interesting exercise for me. I was able to benchmark the SNT. I saw a number of trends emerging from that, including some worrying ones, which was, as I say here, a sort of stagnation potentially in macro innovation. You know, where was the next Apollo? Where was Concorde? You know, where was the next space shuttle? There were also some worrying signs about the average age of an aerospace and defense sector worker. This is sort of 15 years ago now. It was in the average age was about the mid-50s. It's still in the mid-40s, and you know, that left me wondering about, you know, what might be the underlying causes of that. But the overriding conclusion I came to was that there was a wealth of untapped technology out there, with some sector problems underneath them all. So if we think of what we see in the aerospace and defense sector as an iceberg, what I submit that you do see in terms of the platforms that the sector builds, in other words, ships, aircraft, tanks, and weapon systems, is the bit above the waterline you see of an iceberg. Very little, in fact. But what is below the waterline is generic science and technology and know-how that is applicable to a great many other sector needs. One of which, it was very clear, was climate, because the aerospace and defense sector builds a range of technology and capability that spans, as we've seen in this fabulous webinar series, orbitals, deep space technology even, right the way through the atmosphere into subsea. So it clearly knew about areas like climate, I thought, but what was stopping this technology that could go to help some of these grand global challenges? What was stopping them coming through? Well, the answer, of course, is that governments exert the pull factor. In fact, the defense side of aerospace and defense companies doesn't move unless governments exhort them to. But it struck me too that this was technology that we as taxpayers, and of course governments, had paid for. So why was it sitting below the waterline? And one of the fundamental capabilities that came through in this Jane's audit that I did was, of course, that all of these 9 prime contractors had this unrivaled systems of systems capability to build and put together big architectural stuff. So the key thing that came out of this for me was, how did we access all of this potential from below that waterline on that imaginary iceberg, and how did it map to grand global challenges? Well, when I assembled 8 of the 9 CTOs together in Washington, DC at a conference with President Obama's science advisor, John Holdren, the conclusion we came to was that the technology was there. It could be exerted on grand global challenges. The problem was the aerospace and defense sector's business model. As it says on this slide here, A&D companies don't assume risk on their own dollar. They get governments to pay for their risky endeavors, so whether that's in development activity or in production. They very rarely put money into that themselves. So because most global challenges interface with the commercial world, we found ourselves at an enormous deadlock and impasse. And then, as I say here, in 2014, ISIS emerged as a threat, Russia annexed Crimea, and all of this wonderful activity that we'd been looking at to try and loosen up aerospace and defense sector science, technology, and know-how into the grand global challenge domain sort of went away. This 5-year window just closed in 2014. But of course, the grand global challenges hadn't gone away. And in 2020, this was really the year everything changed. When the pandemic struck, we saw what aerospace and defense could do, because a lot of these companies that you see down on the bottom left-hand side of the screen had mobilized to build ventilators and respirators and PPE. So this was demonstrable proof of what could be done. So my response, and I'm delighted to say abetted by my colleagues, a number of whom are on this panel today, we said, well, if A&D is doing its bit and nurses and doctors are doing their thing, and everyone else a lot of other people are responding to the COVID-19 challenge, what could we do? Well, the answer was I launched something on my corporate strategic storytelling website called Call to Action. And Call to Action really does tell a very different side of the A&D story. It demonstrated that A&D could rise to a grand challenge. It demonstrated too that it had systems of systems skills and tech know-how that it could bring to bear. It was also able to operate cross-sector. And it had an extremely agile response when it needed to in this predominantly sort of commercial arena. It could adapt its SME base and its supply chain to respond to an emergency like the pandemic. And a key one for me was that it should engage the millennial and Generation Z mindset, because as we saw earlier, the Generation Z and millennial generations weren't engaging in the aerospace and defense sector as they perhaps should have been for those unknown reasons I mentioned at the beginning. But the key point was, if A&D can do this for one global challenge, imagine what it can do for the full panoply of them. So we've launched this call to action. As I say, it is a top-down, bottom-up endeavor. From the top down, we're interviewing key people in and outside the aerospace and defense sector. So that will range from people in NGOs who have a humanitarian or a need on the humanitarian front line, and also people within the sector who are beginning to appreciate, I think themselves, that they have key capability to lend to these global grand challenges. From the bottom up, we are addressing a social media campaign, and particularly keen to bind the millennial and Generation Z generations into this discussion, because without them, it's really not going to work. The global grand challenge problems, whilst they are here, are predominantly going to strike in the generations ahead. So we need that engagement. So that is largely it from me for now. I just want to sort of summarize by saying call to action is an awareness campaign. It's about making governments aware that this prepaid asset exists. And as it says here on this slide, we have calculated, based on some pretty meaningful discussions with people in the sector, that each major aerospace and defense nation has about $1 trillion of IP and know-how locked up in the aerospace and defense sector that can be brought to bear on global grand challenges. If governments act, we know that aerospace and defense will follow, and it has a track record of what I say here is doing the impossible, getting human beings onto the moon, or building a phenomenal Mark II transport aircraft like Concorde. There is absolutely no time to waste. And this is an endeavor that is not just something aerospace and defense should be doing for all kinds of moral and ethical reasons, but because there is money in it. This is an adjacent market to the core market of aerospace and defense. No one, least of all me, is advocating it should give up. But this is what is calculated to be at least a $4 trillion adjacency that sits alongside the $2 trillion annual global defense market. I also happen to think that it will reinvigorate aerospace and defense. And obviously, I'm very keen to hear what the panel and our esteemed guests and attendees to this webinar session today, what you think as well. But with that, thank you very much indeed. And I now hand over to my colleague, Charles Chase.
Thanks, Nick. Let me get my screen up here. Okay. Let me just go to the... Okay. So, thanks, Nick, and thanks everyone for having me join in on this and contribute my thoughts. Just a little background. I was a Lockheed Martin Senior Technical Fellow. I recently retired. And when I was at Lockheed, I founded the Revolutionary Technology Programs, which was the technology front end of the Skunk Works, where we worked to develop breakthrough technologies that would not only support the mission of Lockheed Martin and defense, but also potentially help the world in other ways. So an example of what we did was up here in the corner is our hot fusion experiment. And this is an approach of generating energy for everyone to deal with some of the global challenges and the billion people in the world right now that don't have electricity. So that was really a noble endeavor still going on at Lockheed now. And it was enabled by the skill set that was already at Lockheed in things like directed energy and low temperature plasmas for flow control. And with that skill set, it enabled us to do something like work on hot fusion. Another important thing that in my background is I led a moonshot team to search out throughout Lockheed Martin what are the best technologies that could potentially be unlocked to enable this, on the order of $1 trillion market share that Nick was alluding to. Now, since I've retired, I've, with my partner, Kate McKinnon, we have founded the Unlab. And the Unlab is a little different. It's a nonprofit. We're dedicated to speaking for the ideas themselves. So we are trying to make breakthrough technologies happen that can help the world. And, it might be surprising, but maybe not, in how many people in our government, in the research labs in the government, are behind this mission and what the team here is trying to accomplish about using technologies to help the world. There's people in all the government agencies I've met that really get behind that idea. And so here at the Unlab, for example, we have a couple of grants, both from DARPA and the Office of Naval Research, to work on some disruptive breakthrough technologies. One thing that we really believe in is this idea of unlimited abundance. And I think that there are technical solutions to all the problems that the panelists brought up that are just really present now and are looming and really seem almost impossible to deal with. And this idea of unlimited abundance, if you think about what we have been able to create from what we found here on the earth, like for example, from metal ore, we can make these beautiful sculptures as just a simple example of how when we put things together in a different way, a new way, things that are already here, we can create things that we once thought were not possible. So I'm gonna cover just a few examples of things that may seem impossible, but that really, based on the abundance we already have, could really change the game. And so let me just go through those really quick. This is an idea, and this is work being funded by DARPA, and the Unlab is working this teamed with Princeton and Stanford. And this is an idea of taking forces and energy from vacuum fluctuations. And so you might not be aware that physicists consider that the vacuum is alive with an energy that's fluctuating at all times. Now, that is an abundant resource potentially that is there right now for us to tap. So we are working to see if we can make things like little nano motors that rotate on their own just from the energy that we get from the vacuum. So that energy is there all the time. And so these things, and we have found theoretically, we can generate very small forces, turning the vacuum fluctuations into rotating mechanical energy objects. There are also other approaches we're looking at that could potentially generate electricity from the vacuum. So again, this is something that from the abundant resource of just the universe we live in, potentially could enable power and energy for everyone. Another approach, and I touched on this briefly, is hot fusion. So it's another abundant resource. The deuterium, which is used to make hot fusion work, there's millions of years of fuel of deuterium right now in our oceans. 1 out of every 6,000 water molecules is a deuterium molecule. And so that's something the Skunk Works Lockheed Martin is working on. That's the project that I started. But there are also a bunch of other startups, you know, in the UK as well. I'm sorry, I don't have that on here, but you know, General Fusion in Canada, Tri-Alpha is another American company. They probably have the most funding. MIT recently started a new project. Fusion, you know, people joke about fusion, but again, this is another sort of system thing that maybe there's a better mousetrap than the giant national programs that are going on right now in order to crack this. And this would, again, provide electricity for everyone. Another example is this idea of a coherent matter beam that would not only be 1,000,000 times more powerful than a laser, which is something that the defense industry is interested in, but it could also be a replicator. So we could move atoms around the way we want and create something like the Star Trek replicator, where we form objects where we want them based on the atoms that we already have. Sounds impossible, but it's something that maybe that can be done. And then this whole range of things would break through propulsion. You know, I'm not saying that any of these things necessarily work, but this is an example of people investigating new ways of generating propulsion without any propellant, of converting gravity to electromagnetics so that you can use that to power things. And that's Professor Raymond Chow up at UC Berkeley. And, you know, maybe we've seen some of these UFO videos that are out there. I don't know what they really are. Maybe they're us spoofing ourselves. Maybe they're us from the future. But, you know, if things could fly like that, we should be able to make things fly like that too. And so what's the problem? You know, here are all these great things that would just really change the game. Talking about changing the game and how things are and how the world is, you know, what we can do as a world. Well, and Nick mentioned this quite strongly. There's a fundamental issue, and that's financial risk. And so I tried to make a little comparison here between the F-35 system design and development and Boeing 787. And you can see the development costs there are $55 billion for the F-35, $32 billion for the 787. The F-35 was completely funded by the government, cost plus incentive fee like contracts. So your costs, and then you got paid profit to develop the product that you had a customer that they were going to buy. So no Lockheed Martin money was ever at risk. 787, totally different story. It's based on what they predicted the customer demand would be. All the money was at risk, you know, from other people, not necessarily Boeing's money because they get people to invest, but money is at risk, and the potential profit is late 2020 at all. They don't have guaranteed customers. And on top of that, I don't know if that shows on the bottom of the slide, but everyone's incentives and leadership are based on profit and loss and bonuses and not innovation. And so, you know, it's hard to get the A&D sector to focus on that. Not that they haven't tried. So here are some examples of, and these are all things that are publicly in the press that Lockheed Martin has tried to do. And I, you know, use Lockheed Martin because of course that's what I'm most familiar with. You know, a diabetes treatment based on a graphene thing, and new types of energy storage, using the tide for energy, a new approach to water desalinization. You can see what Ray Johnson, who's our CTO that worked with Nick back then, said. It's just one example of efforts to apply some of the advanced materials to global environmental and economic challenges. And of course, compact fusion. So it's not like we didn't want to try, but none of those things have ever worked. They work, but they have never turned into reality and the abundance that can be, at least not yet. And it's, you know, it's hard for these reasons in our established organizations. And I think I'm pretty close to the end of my time, but people have different motivations, you know, in academia where prestige papers, you know, are really valued, you know, at A&D, the shareholder value, the government, maybe the research labs or transition, startups, next series funding round. So everyone has different motivations, and can we bring that together? So I think A&D has the skills to work on high risk breakthroughs to address global challenges. You know, will they? And I think it's going to take something a little different, a different model. And, you know, we've been thinking about at the Unlab about a national or an international transnational service program, a new model, something, a different way, an environment that's designed for the creation and innovation of these abundant technologies, something with a persistence of vision, and a coalition team that includes industry, academia, government, military. And that way, A&D can fully participate with all their skills, and we get around maybe some of the, you know, the inertia in the organizations. And so, yeah, thank you for your time. And then
thank you,
on
Charles.
to Pablo.
Hello, friends. Thank you, Charles. Thank you, organizing team. This is delightful to be here and to be part of this. My name is Pablo Suarez. I am still a little bit of a researcher on climate disasters, system dynamics. I'm affiliated to Neil's team at UCL, Department of Science, Technology, Engineering, and Public Policy, as well as a few other teams. But most of my time, I'm a humanitarian worker. I'm in charge of research and innovation at a global team. We are active in 190 countries. And it's complicated to be here now with you. The complication arises from the fact that the aerospace and defense sector, in part because of its business model of creating weapons, is seen as toxic for those of us who are in the humanitarian development, civil society, NGO sector. Indeed, I am not here in my capacity as a humanitarian representing my organization because I couldn't do that. Because there are firewalls, there are barriers separating all that massive talent, expertise, know-how, financial muscle, technological breakthrough capability of the aerospace and defense sector, separating that from us. I have worked in 65 countries, and it is my job to go to places like those informal settlements in Nairobi and help people understand what can go wrong and what to do about it. Whether it's tomorrow's extreme rainfall or heat wave, or long-term trends that augment food insecurity, shelter demands, migration, all sorts of things. Shahid, if we could share the first slide. I have only 5 unconventional slides to share with you the prospects of how things look. Jano, could I invite you? Jano, could you please go to the other room? Sorry, I am not the only inhabitant of this space, and more things are happening. So, as this shows, trouble happens and disasters can collaborate better than we do. Right now, I am trying to support national teams that are dealing with the coexistence of coronavirus, climate, armed conflict, and a dissolving economy. Whether it's Afghanistan, where more people die because of droughts and floods than because of bullets and explosions, or the Republic of Vanuatu in the South Pacific, where recently there was a Category 5 tropical cyclone, and people couldn't follow standard procedure of evacuating to shelter because that would have augmented the risk of coronavirus, and they don't have enough, you know, respirators and all the things that are needed. So if the real world threats are collaborating without intentionality, but they're collaborating better than we are, what can we do about it? What should we do about it? How can we bring our talents, our forces, our territorial presence together? If we move to the next slide, this is one of my favorite cartoons by Bob Mankoff. It is depicting what seems like a quotidian day for a couple sitting on a couch having a conversation. But the couch is on a river that is about to go off a cliff. And we know that both in climate systems, in technological systems, in geopolitical systems, change tends to be gradual until it is abrupt. We are now confronting a lot of possibilities for very turbulent change if it hasn't manifested already. And the caption pretty eloquently says, we've got to talk. Well, guess what? Most of what we have heard so far in terms of the needs of reorienting some of the phenomenal powers of aerospace and defense towards the global challenges that matter to us. If you click again, Shahid, just a minor list: health, food security, shelter, even human resources. How do we get talent? We in the humanitarian sector have a similar problem as aerospace and defense, that we need to make it more palatable for those kids with tattoos and weird earrings and strange musical tastes to want to join us, because they believe in different mindsets. They're completely open-minded. They don't like to do the kinds of things that they're expected to do if they have all those security constraints that are present. And, you know, geopolitics, ways of working. How can we have a better conversation? What are we going to do about reorienting what we are capable of? For the next one, this one is by another dear colleague, Pat Burns. He's a cartoonist. He used to be a cruise missile designer, a weapons developer turned humorist. And his caption says, you know, to important people, remember, we can only afford to do this pro bono because of how much anti-bono pays. Of course, in our sector, the aerospace and defense, especially the weapons development side, it is anti-bono. It is designed to do the opposite of what we do. We are trying to save lives. Those weapons are part of geopolitical systems, etc. But can we help all the talent within to imagine the way of configuring your ability to influence how money is spent? I don't approve the portrayal that my dear friend Nick Cook shared, that the A&D space waits for government to come and give them the money and then they develop the weapons. There must be some capability for lobbying. There must be some capability for influencing the senators, the people who control the check writing. How about influencing them to invite the sector to go massively in the direction that Charles and his partner Kate, I loved spending time with them at their home, at their event at MIT. They are eager, as many others in the sector, to do good. And we can mobilize the talent for global challenges in a way that is compatible with the current aspirations of so many of us. For the next one, the next slide, please. This is one of the things that we hear a lot. Important looking person on the phone says, no, Thursday won't work. How about never? Is never good for you? That's one of the discourses I keep hearing. Some of our aspirations are encountered with a language of civility, with a content of, well, the world doesn't care about what you care about. We're more interested in making money or cruise missiles than we are in, I don't know, finding unlimited energy or solving shelter problems. I refuse to accept that premise. I don't believe that everyone is saying, how about never? Because never is not good for too many of us. And we can change the way we converse. We can offer, we can demand, we can invite a re-examination of what happened to those taxpayers' monies and how we can influence the way we think about the future so that never is not in the horizon and so many beautiful ideas can become a reality. My final slide, which is, all options are on the table, says a big white man confronting a giant bomb of some sort. Well, how about putting more prominently on the table of the aerospace and defense sector global challenges? How about a much more proactive aspiration to engage all that massive capability under the water level that Nick showed, all the phenomenal capabilities that Neil Morisetti has been commanding in his time as the military, to put those options on the table? How can we do good? And I am certain that these will have geopolitical consequences for those who invest. Whichever nation can help solve problems can become a big influencer. as well as on the market front. Maybe they will start investing their own money and developing tools that help address what we need to address. I am here in my personal capacity, but I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be conversing with you, and I hope this can be just the beginning of a long-term transformational conversation where civil society, humanitarians, and development workers can be part of the exuberant joy of brain power that you guys have. Just spending time with some of you really augmented my ability to imagine solutions, and some of that can overspill to the entire sectors. Hopefully we can become more of one while staying candid and true to our purposes. Thank you. Over to you as we move on with this program.
Well, thank you all, indeed, panelists. That were remarkable presentations. And Pablo, thank you very much for introducing humour and a sense of satire there, which is wonderful and really does make you think. Those simple images from your cartoonist friends really did set things alike. And I think what kept coming back to me is that there seems to be this absolute agreement, really. I know as perhaps a small group at the moment of us talking, certainly today, that A&D can offer a huge amount in terms of the resources it has, the technology, the ability with systems management structures to do an awful lot to address those incredibly desperate global challenges that we see, that Shahid's presentation right at the start showed so graphically, the human suffering and despair. And yet, for all that, and indeed we heard from Charles, those the technologies that have been looked at, that people want to work on, that are working on, that could almost eliminate some of those things if they got taken up properly. And yet it hasn't been happening. Everybody knows what the problems are. There seem to be their technologies there, but not quite the will to tie it all together. And so I wanted now to bring the panelists back in and to ask some of the questions before we move on to the second part of our webinar with the next generation leaders. And if I could start with a question from myself, but I think going back to why these discussions have not opened up, why this cross-sector cooperation is not happening. To Neil. Neil, you've worked obviously at the highest echelons of the military world, but also in government as a diplomat. Can you give us an insight, or give me an insight as to why, whilst we can see these things are necessary, could happen, that the discussions don't seem to have been happening, and that will hasn't pulled things together so far?
If I had a magic wand and I could sort that one out, life would be easy. I think part of the challenge is, and my fellow panelists have touched on it, everyone's operating in stovepipes. They've got busy day jobs, and to date, perhaps there's been enough going on, particularly in the sector, to allow the bottom lines to be balanced and the books to be balanced and everything. And there have been periods perhaps where there's been less activity, and Nick described the sort of 2011 to 2015 timeframe. But the bottom line is something that Pablo just said. You know, the aerospace sector and humanitarian sector are not natural bedfellows. They're not natural partners. There are natural partnerships around the world. We find ourselves in them on a daily basis, and it works really well. This is one we're going to have to work at. We have to recognize there's a challenge out there, the sort of challenges I talked about and others have spoken about. And what we've learned from these webinars is that there's some opportunities to address those challenges from this sector. But we need to bring them together, and there'll be other intermediaries as well, be it governments or academics or whatever. We've got to build that process. We've got to ensure that they can find common objectives, that they can see a common language, and they can see co-benefits. And benefits, you know, there's an immediate benefit in the sense we address some of these humanitarian challenges. There's a benefit for the sector. I mean, in dollars there's a benefit, but more importantly, the sector starts to be seen as a valuable member of society and contributing to society, not just there to develop weapons of destruction or whatever. And then perhaps that will bring some of the younger people in as well, because they'll start saying, hang on, yeah, this is something that's relevant. It's got some purpose. It's attaching itself and attacking the challenges we face today. But this is not easy. You know, it takes effort, it takes a lot of work, and you've got to recognize that, you know, the sector and humanitarians, as Pablo said, are not natural bedfellows, but I think we can get there.
Well, that's great to hear. Before I bring in the others again, just staying with you for a moment, Neil, because you've worked at that level with government ministers, with the Foreign Secretary, indeed, do you think that part of the problem would be that, A, political leaderships, wherever they are, or mostly wherever they are, certainly in democracies, will be coming and going and changing. They'll be looking to the shorter term. That the political will to sort of engage in this sort of debate, this sort of project, is lacking. Obviously, there's lots of talk at the moment about rebuilding the post-COVID economy in a greener way. But will that, which would clearly, would encourage, you would hope, the bringing in the A&D sector, or encouraging the A&D sector to look at those areas of their research, that area of their research, is that likely, do you think, or is there going to be a huge stumbling block, whatever the A&D or the humanitarian sector might try and work together, that the governments around the world will still be rivaling each other, let alone their local political oppositions?
Yeah, I mean, I think you put your finger on a real challenge, in the sense that the horizons of elected politicians tend to be relatively short, in some cases 2 years, 4 or 5 years if you're lucky. There's a huge amount going on. There's only so much political capacity and capability to tackle these things. And therefore, the narrative has to be about benefits and co-benefits. Not only the benefits for the recipients of action, whether it be those where we're addressing humanitarian challenges, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the sectors, but also the benefits to society as a whole. And ultimately, it's got to make the politicians look good, because only then will they stay engaged in the process. Otherwise, we'll start to talk about a green recovery from the pandemic, and then something else will come along and people say, sorry, we haven't got time for that, or this is taking too long. So you've got to find those immediate benefits. Climate change is a good example, actually. Just saying we've got to say change the climate because it's going to save some flora and fauna isn't going to work. You talk about clean energy. Clean energy brings you better health, less respiratory issues. Therefore, there's less money spent on that, more money spent in other areas of health or other areas of government. It brings you stability of prices for your energy, rather than fluctuations in fossil fuels, because they come from the unstable parts of the world and they're global commodities. And it increases stability around the world. It's only when you start to talk in that sort of language and you start to see some of those things like the improved air quality, as we've seen during this pandemic, immediately, that you start to get the traction. And then again, you need the society message, particularly from the younger people, to pursue this.
And from your experience, Neil, this is just a question that's coming in on the panel. Do you think, having been up close to government, that people actually believe this is possible? Or is it something that's just something worth nodding towards, but really we're never going to get that level of cooperation on all those levels?
If I can quote an example at my own expense, when I was the Foreign Secretary Special Representative for Climate Change, an organisation called Carbon Tracker came to me and talked about stranded assets. And I said, this is fascinating, it's brilliant, but it's never going to fly. You will never get it through because it is too long term and it's too attacking some vested interest, etc. I've been proved completely wrong. So these things are possible. It's just a case of perseverance and a good story and a really good narrative to go with it, which is something which perhaps we're not so good at in some parts of the world.
Thank you. I see that Pablo and Charles are both nodding over your last comments. I'll come to Pablo in a minute, but Charles, if I could ask you something, it was just intriguing listening to what you were saying about the work that you were doing and the clear desire to do really good stuff. Albeit you're locked in with Lockheed Martin, doing much of your research, much of your career in research. But you were talking about some of the remarkable developments that you were involved with, that your colleagues were working on, that would seem to solve so much, but they failed at the last hurdle almost because there wasn't someone to buy the stuff, in a sense. I wondered if you can talk to this particular issue. You were clearly thinking along those lines about this technology and I saw a talk you gave, I think in 2013, particularly about the fusion thing you were working on, and thinking, well, that's amazing. But was there much talk about, as you were developing stuff like that, well, this is all good for the Lockheed Martin business, perhaps within our aerospace and defence business, but really could we be using this or getting this somewhere else, or should we set up a separate division of Lockheed Martin that won't be looking just at aerospace and defence, well, maybe aerospace, but civilian aerospace, but also there's other issues? I wondered whether that was ever part of the company thinking, or indeed the thinking amongst colleagues.
Yeah, that certainly was part of the thinking, was that, we really needed a way of, if we were successful with, showing that we could produce fusion, we needed another approach and a separate entity really to roll that out. And we definitely did consider what the potential value was to the Lockheed Martin Corporation. And I think that, you know, one of the issues is always the time frame of leadership. And I think you brought that up, is that you can convince one set of leadership that this is a good thing to do, and okay, let's go do this, and we're all behind it, and, you know, we'll support it. You know, people move on to other things, other people come in, and it's a whole new set of people to convince. And then also, you know, and they have different motivations, and maybe the environment changes. So this whole idea of persistence of vision is really, really difficult when you're, you know, trying to do something internal without a, you know, a customer. You know, we're used to having a customer with a requirement, and yeah, then we'll keep at that, that's for sure. But something that we're investing in because it has potential to do something, you know, it's hard to keep it up. I guess, I'm not sure if I exactly answered your question, but.
No, you did very well, but also I was intrigued that just thinking of the development of the fusion for energy generation. Where is that now? Because I just looked and thought, well, this surely now somebody, you could sell that, develop that, particularly with, I think, the idea of putting a container on the back of a truck, and you could power up a small city to be able to send them around the world. I mean, I remember when Nick first introduced me to the idea. He and I have known each other for years, but he introduced me to this call to action. And he said, think about, you know, if you could do that, or take that, or the desalination plant that you could put somewhere.
Yes.
Wow. And you think, well, if the technology is there, surely we can even do that, even if, as Neil says, there's a huge problems getting governments to act. This could just be a really brilliant spin-off business, I would have thought.
Yes, it could be. And they're still, you know, they're doing what's called the T5 experiment. So it's the 5th in the series of experiments where they're increasing the amount of energy and, you know, demonstrating the technology. I think that it's taking longer than it really should because of large organizational inertia. And it's just not, it's my experience, I'm saying, is just really hard to do things inside these large corporations. And I think of, you know, alternate sort of models like the Xerox PARC, right, was a beautiful model of developing tons of innovations, and they were, you know, almost like the skunk works of old, where they had huge independence. Not that Xerox made any money off of all the innovations that they came up with at Xerox PARC, things like, I believe, the mouse and other such things. You know, another model is like the Howard Hughes medical grants that are there. Now, they will give a grant to some of the top researchers in the bio field, a 5-year grant. They don't have to do, and they're funding good people to go do good work without any of, if, you know, my involvement in all the, you know, the grants and stuff, do you know how much time the professors and people in industries spend on reporting, writing the next proposal to get more money, you know, on and on and on. It's a miracle that any of the professors have any time to do anything other than try to get funding. So imagine a different model where the people that want to do good work are funded to do that, and they don't have all this other inertia to deal with. I guess I'm on my soapbox.
Well, that's great. That sounds good. I'm just thinking of my life as a radio journalist. I'm forever writing pitches for new series, new ideas.
Yes.
I think are world changing. And will the BBC ever pay me? No, it's a disaster. You know. But
Yes,
that's
yes. It's exactly the same way. Yes, that's it. Yes.
Pablo, if I could bring you in now again. I mean, just that. I mean, those cartoons were fabulous, and I love that one. Brad, we've got to talk of the couple on the sofa going over the rapids, over the waterfall. But what it clearly is so much, and something that you're concerned about, is communication. It's something that we've been hearing from all the panelists. How do we communicate, get people moving, find new ways of communicating, particularly across that hurdle that you very clearly and correctly sort of pointed out, that between the humanitarian organizations, NGOs and whatever, and particularly the A&D sector. How do you make that communication? It's interesting. Obviously, in a few minutes we're going to be hearing from the next generation leaders, many of whom are already focused on A&D work and research in those fields. and hopefully they will be bringing that on. We'll hear from them. But then there are others, as you say, the people with the weird music taste, etc., and tattoos, who we can bring on perhaps on the humanitarian side. And they perhaps, do you see the hope there that the younger generation, the next generation in their 20s, 30s now, will be those who can bring the likes of yourself and, say, Charles, who currently, can be great friends and have great empathy together, but to work together is tricky. Are you optimistic that the next generation leaders from both sides, if you like, of the equation can make that change and force the government out of the logjam that they're in?
If anyone is, like I hope I am, both informed and sensitive to the needs and opportunities of humanity, it's very hard to be optimistic in this day and age. So I don't want to enter the optimism, pessimism, because I don't want to bring down the vibe. What I do know is that regardless of how dark things may get, there's so much that we can do to make it better than it would be otherwise, if only we reimagined what we can do. So to answer your question about communication, I do think that the new generation has a new way of thinking where they believe in, not everyone, of course, there's going to be always the ones who are rewarded by big ego, inflation, and by money and so on. But in the humanitarian sector, we have seen self-organization deliver humanitarian solutions better than us, the big organizations. So if you think of Occupy Sandy, by the time we knew that something was needed, the geeks had already self-organized and delivered the solution. Same with, I don't know, SpaceX. There are people who come from other sectors say, oh, we could do it this other way. And we are not harnessing their talent because we're not giving them the kinds of incentives that they like, that has to do with personal satisfaction, approaches to collaboration, inventiveness. Everything is publicly owned, and GitHub and stuff like that. In terms of how we have that conversation, I am really, really appreciating the serious talent of humorists, because they can help us see in a mirror that they offer to us how utterly absurd what we're doing is. This is so freaking ridiculous what we're doing. We have all these solutions, we have all these capabilities, and we suppress them under that surface without letting solutions emerge. And when I see Charles and Kate saying, I want to do good and I have all these ideas, what can I do? And there's maybe some crumbs falling from the aerospace and defense sector. When I see Nick saying, hey, why don't we have a conversation about mobilizing the power of humanity to solve humanity's problems? Most of that money goes to creating bottlenecks, creating exclusion. So I have a big toy that others don't, and I think I'm more important. We can reinvent how we discuss. We can remember the word humor has to do in its origins, in the etymology, with the word fluid. Humor enables flow. How can we use whatever it takes to show the ridiculousness, to shed light on the gap between what is and what could be? And if we can have those conversations, I think that eventually there's going to be enough reckoning that we're getting closer to that cliff, and the sector can reorient at least a portion of its talent, of its muscle, of its ability to influence where taxpayer monies go, so that we put more of what we can do into what is worth doing for all of us.
Thank you, Pablo. I think you're absolutely right. On one level, it seems slightly superficial, but that humour, the way of making us stop and think as well as laugh, but then that gets the mind working in a positive way automatically, just because the endorphins are going in the right direction, and then that can lead on to open up the debate. I'm going to bring in a couple of questions now, perhaps, and turn it to Nick. We'll in a few minutes. I want to switch to bring in the next generation leaders to our discussion. But this is from Bernard Baxter. He says, many thanks to all of the speakers for your clear, succinct messages. He says, we clearly have the technical skill, so how can we influence the political will to steer our innovation capability towards, for example, the 785 million people without clean water and 1 billion without electricity that Shahid pointed out in his presentation at the start? I mean, Nick, you've been talking obviously for 15 years now to A&D companies. You've brought us together through this project, and there's a lot of people taking it on board. We've been hearing though that the difficulty, particularly of engaging the political world. What's your view on that? You've been leading the charge, so to speak, and I wonder what your take on that was at this time.
Well, I think there are windows of opportunity, you know, and, you know, so I haven't been doing it solidly for the last 15 years, and for reasons that will become clear, which is that, you know, I started out in sort of 2007, 8-ish on this road. That coincidentally was a good time to get involved in getting aerospace and defense sector minds to focus on global challenges, because we had coincident things like Al Gore releasing his movie An Inconvenient Truth, which was being talked about a lot. And then in 2008, the financial crash happened. And that sort of, again, that was a sort of mindset shift, or it prompted a mindset shift that got people thinking differently. And I just happened to sort of hit that window at a good time. And so for the next 5 or so years, that was a really good time to be talking to those aerospace and defense companies about these global challenges. But then, as I said in my talk, 2014 comes along. We had ISIS emerge as the threat that it was and is. We had Russia resurgent, annexing Crimea. And there was this sense, you know, it's kind of metaphorical, but real at the same time. You know, when I went back into the room with some of these guys, CTOs that I'd been working with over the past few years, something had changed. You know, there was a sort of collective look on their faces, which said, okay, this is back to business as usual again. Now, it just happens that we've struck another good time to be holding this conversation because of the pandemic. And that has caused people to think differently again, as a number of panelists have said. And so, you know, I am really hopeful that this dialogue will truly begin. I think what is going to really kick it off is we've got to get governments to realize they are sitting on an asset that is locked up and which they need to release. I don't even think governments, at least the majority of them, even are aware that this asset exists.
Okay, well, that is, as you said, that's
it's there. Sorry, John.
I think that is the call to action that we must all take, whether we're in the States or UK or wherever, to get the governments to think this is a way around it, and it'll also presumably be very good for them, because they're going to look seriously re-electable if they can unleash this thing and start dealing with the global issues. Clearly, the next generation are the key element to this, whether it's in the A&D sector or indeed on humanitarian side. So I'd like now to bring in the next generation leaders who've been working on the webinar project and the series, and they will start appearing, I hope. I'll introduce their names and a very brief line, and then ask them to introduce themselves a little bit and to talk about what the webinar that they moderated, what they got from that and on the whole process, and perhaps how optimistic or excited they feel about the moment in time we're at during the pandemic, and whether that will influence to actually try and change stuff. And then also to get them to address their questions to you, the panel, on what they've been hearing from you today. So I will read out the names if you like, and then let them go in order again, as I did with the first group of panelists. We've got Michelle Huschmidt, who is talking to us from Exeter College in Oxford University. Emma McAlevey, who is at the School of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering at Queen's in Belfast. Likewise, Imelda Friel is there at the School of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering in Belfast. And then we have Aisha Alamani, who is at UCL, but is joining us from Abu Dhabi, I think, today. So welcome all NGLs. If I may let you go, Michelle, first, and then take it in turns, and we'll come back and at the end to readdress some questions to the panel. Off you go. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be able to speak to you, because I am exactly that kid with the weird music taste that you all spoke about. So here I am. To give you a bit of background about myself, I'm originally from Switzerland, and I'm currently finishing a PhD in military history. Now, I am working on the Crusades. I am interested and specialized on the interaction between warfare, religion, and politics. So maybe that gives you already some kind of hint why I'm here. I initially wanted to be a pilot, but it wasn't supposed to be. So my plan after I finish my PhD now is to work in aerospace and defense. Now, I will first talk about the 3 key takeaways that I got from the aerospace and defense seminar. And then, given that I'm here as a next generation leader, I would like to speak about what next. So the first key takeaway that I took from that was that the pilot of the future will interact more closely with AI than ever before. And the reason for this is that AI will be able, and already is able, to process and analyze much more data than the human mind is capable of. That leads me to my second point, which is that AI will also become much more personalized for the pilot, which means that information about geography, but also about human psychology and game theory, all of this will interact in a more complex way with the final decision that always needs to be taken by the pilot in the aircraft or on the ground. Finally, the third point that I would like to point out was that states will be able to customize their air defense capacity appropriate for their geographical size, their population size, and as well as their budget capacity. So if I look back on the panel discussion that we had, these were some of the main points that people came up with, and that seemed to inform some of the way forward, how we can use aerospace and defense for global challenges. Now, I'm doing this very, very quickly because whoever is interested may then look at the aerospace and defense webinar and can see that itself. So that leads me to what next? How do we actually address this, these global challenges? And I have 3 main points that I'd like to point out. The first is, I was always struck by the importance of interdisciplinary collaboration. Now, people are already doing a great job in terms of engineering and production development and financing and commercial awareness. But I would like to take it a step further, and I am very much in favor of interdisciplinary collaboration that goes beyond what is just available in the tech sector and the aerospace industry. One example is people like me, who have a background in history, have a background in politics, have a background partially in psychology. So talk to people like us, because we can bring a new perspective that doesn't seem obvious, but that shouldn't be dismissed out of hand. The second point is, I am convinced by what I heard that there will be a more complex interaction between the private and public sector. Even now, this has come up very, very frequently, and there seems to be some kind of hesitancy on both sides of whether or not there will be openness to collaboration. And I am very much in favor of keeping an open mind and talking to people and giving it a go. Now, what is important for that is my third point. And during the aerospace and defense seminar, someone really interestingly pointed out that even though he was an engineer and he was working with people who had a really different background, they shared a common language. Now, once you go into an interdisciplinary collaboration, this common language is missing. You will talk to people who do not share your language with, who will come, especially from a non-tech background, who will talk very, very differently over problems that are at its core similar, but the way it will sound is really different. I noticed this myself when I started for the first time to talk to people who were really outside my field. And instead of sources, which is what historians talk about, I started talking about data. And suddenly their heads, like their faces lit up, and they were like, oh, I see now. So it's minimal differences, but you need to be aware of how big the difference can be. So my plea really is, if someone talks to you and they seem to not make a lot of sense initially, do not dismiss them outright. And that is especially true. I personally think that the humanities have a lot of skills to offer. And my final plea before I lead to my next NGL would be that what we can offer are excellent communication skills and intercultural awareness. And we can bring a new way of thinking about a problem. And I think that is the problems that we're facing today are too important to dismiss an entire area of talent and human potential. So please look at us and sit down and talk to us, because one of my experiences was when I told people coming from my background, I wanted to work in aerospace and defense. Sadly, what Pablo Suarez said, that was very true. I encountered a lot of prejudice and a lot of misunderstanding because of the image problems that the sector sadly has. And I think even people like me who are very determined to break into the sector, we need to have help in order to show our own people, so to speak, that it is really worth it. Thank you very much.
Eamon, should do your mic?
Yeah, sorry. Thanks, Michelle. I think I am next here. Hi, I'm Emer McAlevey, and I am a research fellow at Queen's University Belfast, as John had already said. I'm currently working on a proof of concept project, which is quite close to my heart. I'm using some nanotechnology to develop a novel, low-weight, low-power anti-icing de-icing system for an engine nacelle. This kind of project is very close to the area which I'm quite passionate in, which is translating technological innovations from a research environment to a viable commercial system. And I think that that's something that historically we haven't done well, and certainly listening to everybody today and from my own webinar is something it's vital that we improve on at the minute. During the civil aviation webinar, we talked at some length about bringing innovation back into aerospace and the importance of that, not just to reinvigorate the aerospace sector, but also to start to address some of the huge environmental impact that the aerospace sector has and address that global challenge. There were a couple of ways which in the webinar which really came to the fore as the two main thrusts to which we could improve the environmental consequence of aerospace. And the first one was to change our power plant design. Electrification is becoming increasingly important. We must reduce the carbon footprint of the aero engines we have at the minute. There are huge strides being made in this technology. There's a lot of research happening. We need to start translating that into a commercial environment. The second was looking at composite materials. We've learned a lot about composite materials in the last 10 years. We know a lot more about their behavior, how to apply them. We now have the capabilities to make much more lightweight structures, to make the more complex geometries we need, to make more efficient aircraft. A blended wing is absolutely in our sights. We have the ideas, we know how to do it. Again, we need to start translating this technology to harness the capabilities we have, to make more efficient aircraft, to reduce their energy consumption, and again, to make a big impact in the environmental changes that we need to see. So these are the two issues really that came out of the webinar, which I saw, and they're both quite significant ways that we can impact the global challenges that we face at the minute. Aerospace is stuck. There are no new aircraft on the horizon. At the minute, it's really in crisis, as are a lot of industries. But I think that we need to consider that this needs to change, because 2030 is coming up. We're 10 years away. It's pretty close. We can't wait another 30 years for these innovations to take place. I suppose just to say on a personal level as well, taking part in the webinar series was a real privilege of mine, speaking to the panelists beforehand and getting to pick their brains and ask them 1,000 questions about what they knew about innovation, about the aerospace sector, and just to hear the enthusiasm and the will for change that was there. It was quite exciting for me to hear that, because certainly when you look at the aerospace sector, it seems sluggish, it seems resistant to change. But on a personal level, when you talk to a lot of people, the will is there to make the change, and that was quite good to see. And I suppose I left the webinar with quite a feeling of optimism, because even though we are in crisis at the minute, I can see that there is, the ideas are there, the research is there, and there are people there who are willing to make the changes. And we just need to get them together and talk, as everybody had said, and we need to make a plan. And I think next we have Aisha.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ashin Manai, and I'm an astrophysics PhD student at UCL's Moderate Space Science Laboratory. I work on extracting stellar parameters from millions of stars in our very own galaxy, the Milky Way, using Gaia's mission spectral data to understand basically how and when our Milky Way was formed using machine learning techniques. I'm also part of the Light-1 CubeSat mission, which is a very small mission, which won the UAE Space Agency mini satellite competition during my undergraduate studies at New York University of Abu Dhabi. So this mission ultimately aims to detect terrestrial gamma ray flashes, which are flashes that are produced by lightning and thunderstorms from Earth's atmosphere, which we don't have an idea exactly of how they're formed. We can theorize about it, but hopefully this mission is going to be launched next year if COVID doesn't delay it further. Aside from being passionate about understanding high energy phenomena, I'm also really passionate about science communication and co-founded Arab Women and STEM platform, and have helped organize multiple science communication events at the Science Museum with my fellow classmates. We formed a club called the UAE STEM in UK group in London. The panel that I've co-moderated was called Space's Role in Tackling Earth's Challenges, where our discussion addressed three areas mainly. One, which is the current and future trends in space activity. Two, what knowledge and expertise gained from space activity can offer to the wider society meeting 21st challenges. And three, what needs to be done to maximize knowledge transfer. Now, although a summary of the discussion we've had at the webinar won't do justice to the webinar itself, but there are multiple lessons that I have personally learned from the panelists. From Lily Forward, an engineer at Surrey Satellite, I've learned to be open to new space technologies, but also be critical to its cost effectiveness and how it can affect us politically or even geopolitically. For example, the impact of space launches, the impact of space launches to the environment and how that affects our global changing climate. Now, from Jean-Christophe Maudet, a space diplomacy lecturer at UCL, I've learned the importance of laying out space policies to meet global challenges and revisit older ones like the Outer Space Treaty. So even more now, as countries have become more and more involved in space activities and more countries are launching satellites into space. Now, currently, we have already managed to affect the environment on Earth. We do not want to do that with space. From Sonny White, a director at Limitless Space Institute, and he's also an engineer, I've learned that persistence and hard work can make you skilled. But being creative and imaginative can make you innovative. And when it comes to solving problems, we really need the two. We can't just focus on technical people who are willing to deliver the technology. We also need to use our imagination and take a step further to, making even more creative technologies and tackling global challenges. From Nicole Stott, a previous US astronaut, I've learned that living off the grid in space is a habit we can all learn on the ground to become much more resourceful Earthlings. And finally, last but not least, from our co-moderator, Neil Morisetti, the importance of bringing people together to discuss and solve problems. So these are the main points that I learned and I took away, the main messages from the webinar itself and from the ongoing discussions I've had. Now, there was something that Charles said that struck to me, which is basically how bureaucratic writing grants are. I know I've worked, I'm currently, I'm part of a mission, and I know the struggles and the time it is to just write a grant to just, you know, have like $1,000 to fund a small piece of instrument, and the time it takes. There's also a lot of discussion that was that revolved around corporations about taking a role in funding projects. Now, the bigger question is, how can, you know, more corporations be more involved in funding the next generation leaders, millennials, Gen Z, whoever we are, put any label on us. But really, we really need to trust in the youth and their future ideas, and even like how, and trust in their creativity as well. You know, writing grant proposals is a daunting job, and one that takes a lot of time to try to convince government entities to fund research projects. But how can we make it easier on us to, you know, get our ideas out there, get us funded, but, you know, get more corporations involved in funding us? So that is a question that I have. And what kind of culture do we need to change? We cannot pass on the same academic or academia culture we've had in the past, I don't know, 50 plus years to the next coming generation. How do we moderate that in the future? So I think I can pass my mic on to the next NGL.
Thank you, Aisha. That's me. My name is Imelda Frale, as John introduced me. I am a postdoctoral research fellow at the School of Mechanical Engineering in Queen's University Belfast. I am part of the Biohaviour Research Group, and we are exploring bio-inspired rules for innovative engineering design. By rethinking design and embracing emerging behaviours for design innovation. The system being developed will exploit cloud services and the Internet of Things to gather live analysis and manufacturing information to inform the design process. I was an NGL on the 4th Industrial Revolution webinar last Thursday, where our panel presented their personal views and experiences of the 4th Industrial Revolution and what it meant from the perspective of their job roles. We had a gentleman, Paul Pereira of GKN Aerospace, who presented his first-hand experience of employing principles of the 4th Industrial Revolution as a response to the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as a professor of cybersecurity who spoke about the intricacies around policy making and the approach to do this in a technology-driven revolution. One key thing I took away from the webinar is that the 4th Industrial Revolution is an evolution of the advances of the 3rd Industrial Revolution, and we're riding the waves of the advances in computing power and technology through multiple applications across various sectors of society. The strength of the 4th Industrial Revolution, and this is something we've heard actually from all our NGLs, is its capability to facilitate collaborative action from a globally displaced actors in an effective and efficient manner when focused on a unified goal. The NGL experience for me has been a unique opportunity in learning about this topic from a mixed bunch of experienced people like today as well, but also a personal learning experience which I have really, really enjoyed. If I may start with a question, John?
That would be great, Imelda. Do go ahead, absolutely.
So after today's webinar, we've seen the capabilities are there within the aerospace and defence sector to address global challenges, and it is encouraging to see that. But on the other hand, we hear that the A&D will only follow government action. What is the most effective, practical way in which young people like us as NGLs and those in attendance can make an impact as we face these global challenges? As Pablo said, push companies or governments to the cliff or waterfall edge to force action.
Who would you put that one to, Imelda?
I'd like anybody who's willing to answer, but maybe start with Pablo.
Thank you for the invitation. So I've had the fortune of working with many young scholars who are trying to align their academic requirements, mostly master's and PhD level, with our humanitarian needs. And we have recruited from atmospheric scientists to health practitioners, to mapping, to game designers, anthropologists, and now scholars from UCL on humor, if you can believe it. The best answer I can give you is that youth will have to invent ways that work for itself. What we're seeing now with the Greta phenomenon and so on is basically the channels offered to youth to try to influence existing systems are not enough to enable you to be who you are. In the UN system, there's usually a slot for one youth representative to give a 10-minute presentation speaking of how important it is to include youth. And youth are rebelling against that. And they're trying to disrupt in loving, respectful, non-violent, but very noticeable ways. And my invitation to you is understand the system that needs to be changed. Don't stand outside and say, you are evil, that's why I'm here, right? I don't call myself youth anymore, as evidenced by this color. But we need to have conversations with those who want to change. That's the most important thing. Youth needs to recognize that there's the Charleses and the Neils and all these folks in all these companies who actually want to do good. They're part of a system that has perverse incentives to keep doing what they're doing, confronts incentives that are not aligned with what the planet needs. You can help challenge that, and you can, just by refusing to do what you don't think should be done, that will make the aerospace and defense sector say, you know what, we need those talents, we need those guys. Maybe we can recruit them to do what they want, even if it's a growing fraction of your time. Good luck to you. You have to invent how you answer that question.
Great stuff.
Can I add to that?
Yes, please. Right.
I think I agree entirely with what Pablo said, and he touched on a point. Charles, Nick, Pablo, and myself, at our age, we've been in our stovepipes for some time. Yes, we've still got contacts outside those stovepipes, but the great advantage you have as a younger generation is if you look at your peer groups from school and university, they're all over the place. They're doing all sorts of things. They're in all sorts of sectors. And you, because you can understand the technology and you can work the technology far better than my generation can, as it comes up and says my internet connection is unstable, you have the opportunity to build that network that can act, because you can bring powerful voices from various sectors and you can lobby those in your own sectors to say, look, actually, we know this can work, we know this can be done, and it addresses challenges, and it will make us look good as a company or us as an organization, which makes the C-suite feel happier as well. So, you know, there's a huge message, powerful message you can get across. And you're an international generation, you're a global generation.
Great.
If I may add to that, we're a much tighter connected generation due to the evolutions from the third industrial revolution, from the fourth industrial revolution, so we can reach out to each other across the globe through these technologies that we have.
That's great. Well, thank you. Just thinking of other NGLs, Emma, Michelle, or Aisha, if you have any questions particularly you wanted to put to Charles, or Pablo, Neil, or Nick, of course.
Yes, if I may go. I would like to ask Nick, but maybe also Charles, as someone who I think has the network on my side, so to speak, where could I dock onto your area that I can be most useful, and where is the starting point? Because as you said, like, one of the reasons why I sometimes feel a bit insecure is because I'm afraid that I'm saying the wrong thing that doesn't make me look like I am serious in my commitment or know where I want to go, whereas very often I do think it's just a language problem.
Well, I'll jump in if I may first, Charles, and I'll hand over to you. But Michelle, I think that so much has changed. You know, when I was a reporter starting out reporting on the aerospace and defense industry, I mean, I was very lucky in some ways because my training meant that I literally had to go out and cover the press release that was all about the widget that went into the bigger widget and all the rest of it. But when I started to ask questions of that industry, and we're talking now about the mid-1980s, there was this prevailing attitude in these rather dusty, fudzy-dudzy boardrooms that people would say to me, oh, we just don't do things like that in the aerospace and defense industry, old boy. And that was very much the prevailing view then. I think, and to my shame, as a shy and retiring learning reporter then, I rather accepted that. And it took me a while to develop the confidence to go, actually, why are you doing it that way? I mean, why do you feel it has to be done that way? And it's been done that way since the Second World War. That doesn't make sense to me as somebody. I don't have an engineering degree, but I'm reporting on your sector. That seems crazy to me. Why are you doing it that way? So, you know, for the sort of single piece of advice I think I'd pass on is be curious. I mean, all of our NGLs clearly are you're all very curious people, but don't be afraid to ask what I used to call as a journalist, the dumb questions. It was the question you didn't think you could ask. Don't be afraid to ask it and confront people with these issues that to outsiders seem nonsensical. I wish I'd done that earlier because I think I could have made more progress. Charles, would you like to add anything to that?
I had to unmute myself. I really agree with what you're saying, Nick, that, and now with the unmute, see, that took up my brain power, but figuring out how to unmute myself. You know, I agree with what Nick has said about, gosh, and I forgot what he said. That's just, but I did agree with you. I'm sorry. Maybe I don't have anything to add.
I was talking about having the sort of the courage when young to ask questions about. Yes. I was too afraid to ask in my youth, which often elicits a sort of a crazy thing that the sector does, which doesn't make sense to any normal, sane outsider.
Right. And so if you're thinking of a question or wondering, don't ever think it's a dumb question, because it means that there are many other people in that room that you're in thinking the exact same thing and wondering also, but maybe have a little hesitancy because they're thinking, well, I must not really look at all these bright people in here and they have all this experience. They must know something I don't. That is not true at all. I think that there's so much to be learned from insights, and especially from out of field of seeing things in a different way, or just people we're mentioning about the language and the issue with different language, and it's even in very adjoining disciplines where, like, optical versus RF, they'll be talking about the same technical thing and they don't even know it because they're using different words. And so, just don't ever be afraid to speak up. And it seems like in the whole, maybe with your background in history of military, the whole strategy area would be something where you could really enter the field. And, there are a lot of places that do a lot of studies for A&D as far as what their strategy should be, what the government strategy should be. And, by asking the right questions for the strategy, you can really help the organizations along, maybe do something that they're not aware of right now, I guess.
Emma or Aisha, I've got a couple more questions from our audience, but if you have something to ask, please do. Your contribution is.
I would ask a good question if that was okay. It's a rather technical question rather than one of the overarching, really insightful questions that Imelda and Michelle have asked, and it's really for Charles. And I was looking at some of the technologies that you were talking about in Unlab and in your presentation, and I was thinking about the real significantly important challenge we have of energy production at the minute, and how we really need to square that circle, and we need to make huge improvements in it, and we need to make them quick. And I think that we do have some technologies that we can implement better, some of the renewables we have, which are doing very well. But the technologies which you're talking about would really revolutionize how we access energy from a domestic to an industrial level. And I was just wondering, realistically, since we're talking about a pivot point of 2030 at the minute for climate change, do you think that those technologies would be ready in any kind of feasible commercial sense by then?
That's really a great question. it could be, but you know, the only guarantee is that if we don't try, nothing is going to happen. That's what we do know, is that if we don't try, it's not going to happen. So, you know, there's no guarantee that it's going to be ready in time, or that even it's possible to generate energy from the vacuum in any meaningful way. But what if it is? You know, we didn't used to think that we could break atoms apart. We didn't know that we can spin a magnet around and make an electromagnetic field that we use for communication and everything all the time. We didn't know those things. But then all of a sudden, hey, look at that. And so that could really happen. And again, like I say, the only guarantee is if we don't try, it's not going to happen. And that's why you need to fund a wide range of things that can break through the energy sector. And it might be in some cross-disciplinary way of someone working here and then something working a little different. All of a sudden, it's the adjacent possible that people talk about, and something new comes about because you put things together in a new way. That's where this unlimited abundance comes from, is we're putting together the pieces we already have. We can put it together in some new way, and all of a sudden it's like, boom. And I really think that, you know, despite all the, you know, yes, it's great to have all electric aircraft. It's great to have renewables, but we can do things that fundamentally change our abundance and the wellness of everybody. And that's what my passion has been to work on, are those things that can change everything for everybody and make things better. And I don't think we should have this sort of viewpoint of fear or, you know, not being abundant, of limitations. I just don't believe in limitations, despite how much rhetoric sometimes there is about how bad things are. And I mean, I guess I'm talking a little more on the political side versus the actual, like yeah, you know, a billion, can you imagine not having electricity or having a bathroom? I mean, it's like people like me, it's like really hard to imagine. And yet there's, like you pointed out, you know, there's a billion people without electricity and almost that amount of people without sanitation. And we can do something about that. And then the whole world would be a better place, much more resonant, much more coherent, much more like humming, if we took care of the pain waves that are out there. Those pain waves, we don't think people, you know, some people in like the privileged world that we're in don't think that those pain waves really affect them. Well, they do. They really affect them deeply. And
Charles, you made a really good point there. Thank you. We are all wrapped up in the as we had right at the start from Shahid, and we're going through it. Pablo, you had your finger up there. I just want to bring in, because we've got to wrap up in a few minutes.
Yes.
I wanted to ask one, actually, Charles, you brilliantly answered one question without even putting it to you from one of our guests, audience members, about abundance and how you would describe that. This is just a question which I think I might bring quickly to Neil, if I might. Again, it's about this, how do we bring this onto the political agenda to get people thinking? It's from Richard Haycox, Neil, who says, isn't this a good way to spend a portion of the international development budget to get it on the political, which would support an outstretched to A&D companies? Is that, I mean, I don't think when you were in your role, you were particularly close to what was then DFID and it is now breaking up, but in terms of the UK development budget, do you see this as something that government could be persuaded to say, right, we can not just spend it on the military defence spending, but also we can spend it on A&D who are working for development projects around the globe that we support?
I think you've got to tread quite carefully in this one. I think BAE Systems or someone else walking into DFID before it goes, or into the Foreign Office and saying, give me 2%, I want to spend it on that, isn't going too well. However, if BAE Systems and Save the Children or something came in together and said, look, we've come up with something, and oh, by the way, this university or that university is working with us as well, and we think it can address some of the challenges that are affecting people around the world, perhaps in the sense of poverty or clean water or whatever it is. And by the way, in doing so, we're going to help that country prosper, and that country therefore becomes a potential market for some of the stuff that's manufactured in this country in other sectors. Then I think you get the politician sitting up and paying attention. But to just wander in and say, I think I want some of that 0.7 of GNI in order to spend in this sector isn't going to wash. But the combined voice is a much more powerful one.
That's fantastic. Well, I think it's that, as you say, it's the combined voices and finding the language in which to communicate to, which takes us back to one of the points that Michelle made. Pablo, I'm going to ask the NGLs to have a brief sum up in a moment, but I know you wanted to say something, I think, on the back of Charles. So if you could briefly make a final comment, that would be brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity. So on the issue of abundance and what can the aerospace and defense sector do, here's an artwork from a cartoonist that I recently acquired. Here's a bunch of people in need of food. Here is a lot of food, and there's a bottleneck where the coronavirus is not letting the food go to people. We're confronting very severe food scarcity and food insecurity. Now, I want to point to one thing. We can deploy technology to augment the supply. But what I'm concerned about is this bottleneck. This bottleneck is artificially created by geopolitical systems that like to be the ones who control flows. I don't agree with the premise that once unlimited abundance exists, then the needs will be covered. There's enough food or ability to produce food for everyone. There are other geopolitical bottlenecks. What I really want, in addition to that unlimited abundance, I want Charles to succeed and everyone else to succeed, but I want the muscle of influencing the thinking at the political levels that the aerospace and defense system has in its own people, in congresses, and in technology development to think about those constraints that are constructive, socially constructive, and they can be dissolved. We can change the motivations, the incentive structures, the way we talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Pablo. That's a fantastically powerful point to take us away, if you like, from just purely A&D and how we address these issues, the enormous political will behind that. But bringing it back to A&D, just for the final few moments, and to our next generation leaders, I wanted to ask, and I know Nick would like me to ask this one, in terms of the webinars that you've hosted and then joining us for today's final one on global challenges, do you think, what do you think of the idea of A&D engaging with global challenges? And if we could take it perhaps very, very briefly, I'm afraid, ladies, because we're literally only got about 5 or so minutes left. But a brief thought, maybe if I start with you, Imelda?
I think on Pablo's last note, he may have answered that question for everybody, is the fact that there is muscle in A&D that can force and encourage action for the right reasons. And I would definitely feel like these webinar series have brought to the front information that perhaps people didn't know existed. You know, knowledge is power, and the more that we know, the more we can use it and leverage it for good. So those are my thoughts. Series like this are so important.
Thank you, Imelda. Aisha, what do you have a final thought on the situation?
Yeah, I could definitely say that those webinars have instilled a sense of responsibility that we all have, whether we're journalists or in the A&D sector, to push for change, for a better change, to address not only issues that lie within our own field, but take a step further in using the knowledge we have to tackle even more global challenges that will, you know, give us a better view or a better look on what the future could potentially look like. And we can be that muscle that, you know, can stretch this further.
Michelle?
I would like to use this to semi-answer a question by Craig Freeman. That is, how can we take steps to define the obstacles that stand in the way of mobilizing these assets that we kept talking about, and how can these obstacles be overcome? So I have two answers to this. On the one hand, organize open panels where you can speak with people. Go and contact people from universities, very young, very young. It doesn't matter if the experience isn't there, because it's the next generation, the vision is there. And then also contact people from the public sector, NGOs, charities, and have an open discussion, and bring in people who seem on the surface to have nothing to say to each other into the same room, and talk openly and face to face, because you have nothing to lose. And then on the next step, hire these people.
Brilliant. Emma, very briefly, sorry, but thank you, Michelle.
Well, very briefly, I think my main takeaway from the webinar series was just the enthusiasm which I gained from having an open platform, of hearing people talk about how they would face global challenges from the ND sector, and seeing the knowledge base is there and that the enthusiasm and that the will is there. And that was very reassuring for me and has left me with a great feeling of optimism that we can face these global challenges and that the N&D sector is there to support it because there is a will within it to do so.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you all very much indeed, everybody. It's been amazing for me. As I said, my background is not A&D at all, but having enjoyed all the webinars, learnt so much from them, been filled actually with enthusiasm to think that there are so many ways the huge global challenges can be changed, and the role that the A&D sector can play in that, if we can get the political will and the cross-sector communications working well. There is a real opportunity here, and Nick's brilliant call to action does have huge legs on it. I think we just need to get them all running in the right direction, if you like. But thank you. We do have to wind up at the moment now, so I just wanted to thank particularly the new panelists who've joined us today: Pablo Suarez, Charles Chase, of course Neil has been part of the team, Neil Morisetti. Thank you again, Neil, for a really interesting contribution. Nick, thank you too, it's been wonderful. The NGLs, Michelle, Emma, Imelda and Aisha, thank you for all your work you've put in. It's been brilliant the way you've supported the project, what you've brought to it, your insights, and especially here to the webinar that I've hosted. It's been wonderful to have your company. Shahid, thank you for your presentation and for making everything work every time. It's brilliant, because if it had been me, well, we'd have been looking at a blank screen and would never have heard a word from anybody. So that's fantastic. And also in the background, to Bert Hunter, who most of us know, I'm sure, but who has whose idea the webinar series was, and has brought this all together and encouraged us to take part. Oh, hello, Charles's cat. Hello, good to see you. I've got one who's shouting outside the door. It's been a real privilege to be here with you today. A privilege to be an observer at your other webinars, and I think it's great. Hopefully we will have these conversations again and again, and we can develop the language and spread the word and get people thinking. Thank you all very much indeed. I don't know if Shahid needs to say anything, but from me, thank you, good luck, goodbye, and stay safe.
Thank you.
Bye all.